So let's go further and talk about this reflexive closed loop system in the process. And really the idea is if you're using some sort of visually detection and feedback as far as your aiming errors and correcting the information, if you go all the way back up to the executive level and use the information processing, it's going to take about 100 to 150 milliseconds at the quickest. So how do you avoid a punch if you were somebody boxing Muhammad Ali? And we know that the average punch for Muhammad Ali is about 40 milliseconds. So how do you do that? And the idea is that you have these reflexive mechanisms because rapid movements, these 40 milliseconds do not allow time for this ability to go ahead and create this error generation, the detection of the error, the determination using information processing on how to correct that error. Or any other of these components that are related to measurement error from the desired outcome and the actual outcome. So to correct that movement prior to completion of these, there needs to be some other form of feed-forward system or ability to use a closed-loop system to go forward. And so these reflexive closed-loop systems, and it really comes down to this, is the idea of this latency of corrections is very rapid, and we can see this through some ENG analyses and the reflexive responses in arm curl. And we know that the ENG response is 35 to 40 milliseconds following the increase in weight when we do an arm curl. But it's this lack of need of consciousness, and that's really where this reflexive closed-loop system comes into play, is we don't need to be consciously information processing. It's a reflexive nature. And really this comes into play with the more and more you practice something and the more and more you prepare, you have this ability to really regulate your force, depending on the task of the participant, depending on your experience. Because remember, if you remember the last lecture, I talked about those interneurons and the ability, in previous lectures we talked about having the formation of multiple references of correctnesses, but that's where this comes in, is being able to utilize these and go to a more creative and quicker response and a reflexive response based off of our experience. So this idea of reflexive mechanisms passes over those stages of information processing, stimulus identification, response programming, and response identification. So it's this idea that muscle spindles and these gamma rays bypass the brain, and that idea, and it creates this more of a reflexive area in the ability to inhibit or stimulate. And you see this mostly in flexion extension in those responses of agonist and antagonist muscles. And think about the knee-jerk reflex. If you went to a doctor and they're trying to test your reflex ability, they might take a little mallet and hit on your knee tendon, right, your patella tendon, and it creates this kick. And so some people have a really strong kick and others have a very small kick, but it's at this level here of the spinal cord, and that's what we're talking about, where you have these interneurons of the alpha and gamma, and your sensory, your afferent and efferent neurons go through the process. So this reflexive is not autogenic, but so the alpha motor neurons activate the target and synergistic muscles, but they inactivate the antagonist muscles with the reciprocal inhibition. And one of the things that we talk about is this ability right here to activate muscles that are the target while inhibiting muscles that are not, is really a level of, is we use this oftentimes as a measure of skill, because the more skilled or the more ready you become in a task, you have a greater inability to really activate and activate those muscles that are created. So we may be able to increase our force production without increasing our force production, right? And so what that means is sometimes I have a force production with the muscles I want, the targeting synergistic muscles. At the same time, I'm activating my inactive. So my total force production and desired movement is reduced because I have muscles that are activating and being contracted to oppose the motion. So sometimes it costs me more energy to produce a motion. But if I'm doing an activity and I have the ability to inactivate those antagonist muscles, my movement is more synchronous and it's more skilled and it's more fluid, and it uses less energy. So So this is just another schematic diagram of the triggered reactions. And again, if you look at it here, here's your sensory input, here's your information processing, right? Here's your desired state or the intended outcome, and we call that the reference of correctness, right? Here's a comparator, and so this is where your error occurs. Now, so what happens is, remember before we had your muscles here, and so this is your proprioception component, okay? And so when we do this, your proprioception has two areas to go, and you can see that here is these schematics. You have M1, M2, and you have all these that are going right back up to the spinal cord. You also have the one that's going down here, which is going to take a little longer, and then you have the output, external feedback, but then you also have the ambient vision and triggered reactions that are coming here. So you see all of these are going directly back to the spinal cord, and this is that ability to bypass the information processing at the level of the spinal cord. So it's still going to the CNS, but it's going to the level of the spinal cord, and this makes for a much quicker response in milliseconds and more of those triggered reactions in a quicker response going forward. So this feed-forward system readies the systems for the upcoming commands, and really it creates this ability to receive this particular kind of feedback information and provide this mechanism to allow a feed-forward component that continues to ready this for the next step without having the information processed. So we continue, and this is a lot happens to do with walking and being able to see the environment and go through the processes. Every time we take a step, especially when you're going through a trail, each step is a little bit off and may not be exactly where we are, but you are quickly going to learn where to put your body and prepare for the next step forward. Then we also have things like part of the influence that come from these feed-forward systems or are beneficial towards this is the saccadic eye movement, and that is that sudden jerking of the eye. This is the ability to really investigate the path of execution with the quick movements of the eye. And then you have the inference copy of the limb control, and this is really the information that's sent from the peripheral, and this is the one that goes back to the walking example I just used, to quickly give us an idea of where our limbs are, and it better allows us to control our motion. But this is all, the idea behind this is all to the prediction of the consequences of our desired movement, and not only the consequences of our actions, but the sensory contributions. And so this is all of the feed-forward system just allows us to predict going forward in the process. One of the things that is funny is, can you tickle yourself? And it's the idea that you can, as you consciously think about it, you're not able to tickle yourself. There are a few that can, but most of us cannot.